History Secrets.
The history of great powers is rarely determined only by external wars. Often, the fate of a nation depends on something much deeper, on how it organizes its own society, and on which values it chooses to place at the center of its collective identity. According to a controversial interpretation presented in some recent geopolitical debates, Russia faces exactly this kind of dilemma, a civilizational dilemma, a choice between two models of society. On one side, the consumer model, on the other, the warrior model. In this interpretation, modern consumerism creates a highly comfortable society, but also a deeply passive one. Individuals begin to organize their lives around comfort, entertainment, and material prosperity. Buying, traveling, consuming, seeking individual security. This social structure creates stability, but it can also reduce the willingness for collective sacrifice. Within this logic, a radical critique emerges. An excessively consumerist society may lose its capacity for mobilization. When existential crises arise, its citizens may hesitate to defend the system, or simply prefer to preserve their own comfort. It is at this point that the concept of the high warrior emerges. The warrior represents a completely different mindset. It is not just about a soldier, but about an individual who believes they can shape the course of history, an individual willing to sacrifice personal comfort for collective goals. Within this view, war begins to play a social function, a disciplining function, a way to create national cohesion, structure, meaning, purpose. Some supporters of this interpretation argue that conflicts can strengthen certain aspects of a society. They mobilize resources, create unity, and impose collective discipline. War, in this sense, ceases to be only an instrument of territorial conquest, and begins to be seen as a mechanism of social transformation. This perspective is often associated with what some analysts call Putinism, an idea according to which Russia should organize itself as a warrior civilization, in opposition to the Western liberal model. In this model, continuous war is not only an external strategy, but also an internal instrument, a mechanism to revitalize society. This view suggests that controlled and localized conflicts could discipline a nation. Small wars, regional conflicts, limited military operations. All of this would serve to keep society mobilized, without causing total destruction. According to this interpretation, large-scale wars would be too dangerous, especially in a world with nuclear weapons. Therefore, the focus would be on regional conflicts, limited, manageable, conflicts capable of mobilizing society, without triggering global catastrophes. This idea, however, raises a series of questions. First, if a society constantly depends on war to maintain cohesion, it may enter a dangerous cycle. The economy begins to revolve around conflict. Politics becomes dependent on military mobilization, and internal stability becomes increasingly tied to the existence of external enemies. This type of system can become self-sustaining, but also extremely unstable, because every war requires resources, financial resources, human resources, industrial resources. Over time, the accumulated cost can become enormous, and this can generate a dynamic similar to a pyramid scheme. Each conflict requires new resources, and these resources often need to be obtained through new expansions, new wars, new territories. History offers clear examples of this process. Nazi Germany, for example, expanded its territory through successive military campaigns. Each conquest provided temporary resources, but also required new expansions to sustain the system. This cycle ultimately led to a devastating global conflict. Another important issue involves political leadership. A highly militarized society usually depends on central figures of authority, leaders capable of keeping different groups united, controlling generals, and coordinating national mobilization. But this structure has a weak point: succession. What happens when an extremely dominant leader disappears? Who takes control? And how to prevent internal disputes between military or political factions? This question becomes especially relevant in highly centralized political systems, when much of the stability depends on the authority of a single figure. The absence of this leader can open space for internal conflicts, rivalries among elites, or even fragmentation of the state. For this reason, some analysts argue that the greatest weakness of systems based on personalist leadership is precisely the post-leadership future. When a strong leader is in power, unity may appear solid, but when they disappear, accumulated tensions may quickly emerge. In the case of contemporary Russia, this issue frequently appears in strategic discussions. The current political system is deeply associated with the figure of Vladimir Putin. His authority, experience, and control over political elites play a central role in the regime's stability. But history shows that no leader remains forever, and when political systems depend excessively on a single figure, the transition of power can become extremely delicate. This type of transition has already produced serious crises in various countries throughout history. This does not necessarily mean that collapse is inevitable. States can develop institutions capable of managing succession, creating mechanisms of continuity, and avoiding internal disputes. But the more personalist a political system is, the greater the risk tends to be during moments of transition. Perhaps that is why the central question about Russia's future remains open. Can a society based on permanent mobilization sustain long-term stability? Or does this structure inevitably create internal tensions that are difficult to control? The answer is still not clear. But one thing is certain: just as has happened with other powers throughout history, the true test of a political system rarely occurs at the height of its power. It occurs during transitions, during moments of change, during periods in which new leadership must assume responsibility. And it is precisely in these moments that the fate of a nation can be redefined. To fully understand this theory about so-called Putinism, it is necessary to look more closely at the internal logic of this thinking. Because in this interpretation, war ceases to be only an instrument of foreign policy. It begins to be seen as a mechanism of social engineering, a tool capable of transforming the very nature of a society. The central idea is relatively radical. Modern societies based on consumption tend to become passive. Individuals begin to organize their lives around personal comfort, career, entertainment, economic stability. All of this creates prosperity, but it can also reduce the willingness for collective sacrifice. According to this reading, this type of society may lose its ability to face existential crises. When confronted with external threats, the individual's priority tends to be preserving their own safety, not defending the collective system. This is exactly where the concept of the warrior emerges. The warrior represents the opposite of the consumer. They do not live only for themselves. They believe their actions can influence the destiny of their nation. They accept risks, accept sacrifices, and, in extreme cases, even accept death in the name of a collective purpose. To illustrate this logic, some thinkers use thought experiments. Imagine a group of people isolated in a hostile environment. An island, for example. In that place, everyone faces a common threat. A threat capable of destroying the entire group. In this type of situation, individual rivalries quickly disappear. People begin to cooperate, work together, defend one another. Danger creates unity. Within this logic, war can function as a social catalyst. It imposes discipline, creates structures of cooperation, and generates a strong sense of collective purpose. Even death acquires symbolic meaning. The individual who dies in combat may be remembered as a hero, as someone who sacrificed their life for the good of the community. This way of thinking is not new. Throughout history, many civilizations have deeply valued the ideal of the warrior. Sparta, Rome, various medieval societies. In all these cases, war played a central role in social organization. However, this view also contains deep contradictions, because a society permanently mobilized for war faces enormous challenges. First, the economic cost. Maintaining a war economy requires massive resources, industries dedicated to military production, large contingents of soldiers, constant investment in armaments. Second, the human cost. Even limited wars generate losses. Dead soldiers, affected families, impacted communities. Over time, these costs can accumulate. Third, the risk of escalation. Wars rarely remain perfectly controlled. Local conflicts can expand. Alliances can be activated. Regional rivalries can intensify. This risk has become even more serious in the nuclear era. Today, major powers possess arsenals capable of destroying entire civilizations. For this reason, direct conflicts between nuclear powers are considered extremely dangerous. An uncontrolled escalation could have catastrophic consequences for the planet. That is why some modern strategies seek to limit wars to regional conflicts. Small conflicts, localized, manageable, conflicts that can be controlled without triggering chain reactions. But even this type of strategy contains risks, because each war generates new tensions, new resentments, new cycles of rivalry. In addition, there is another important contradiction within the very idea of a warrior society. A militarized society may produce disciplined and mobilized citizens, but it can also create extremely powerful armed forces. And powerful armed forces have their own political dynamics. Soldiers trained to fight, generals accustomed to exercising authority, highly organized military institutions. These elements can represent a significant political force within a country. Historically, many militarized societies have faced this problem. When the army becomes the dominant institution, it may begin to compete for power with civilian leadership. Coups, military rebellions, internal struggles for control of government. These events appear repeatedly throughout history. This contradiction raises a crucial question. Can a society based on permanent military mobilization remain politically stable? Or does it inevitably create internal forces that are difficult to control? This question becomes even more complex when we consider the factor of leadership. Highly centralized political systems often depend on the authority of a dominant leader, a leader capable of balancing different power groups, controlling political elites, and maintaining discipline within military institutions. While this leader remains in power, the system may appear solid, but when they disappear, the situation can change rapidly. Rival factions may emerge, internal conflicts may erupt, and political structures may fragment. For this reason, many analysts consider leadership succession one of the most delicate moments for any political regime, especially highly personalist regimes. In these systems, authority is not distributed across stable institutions. It is concentrated in a single person. When that person disappears, an inevitable question arises: who takes control? And how to prevent the struggle for power from destroying the system itself? In the case of contemporary Russia, this issue frequently appears in geopolitical analyses. Current political stability is deeply linked to the leadership of Vladimir Putin. His authority has been consolidated over decades. His influence extends across military, political, and economic institutions. But no leader remains in power indefinitely. And when that phase comes to an end, Russia will face a decisive moment. A moment that may define the country's future for many decades. If institutions are strong enough, the transition may occur relatively smoothly. But if the system depends excessively on individual leadership, accumulated tensions may emerge forcefully. This is, perhaps, the real question behind all these theories. Not only the future of Russia, but the fate of any highly centralized political system. Because, in the end, the most difficult test of a regime never occurs at the peak of its power. It occurs during succession. If we provisionally accept this interpretation of so-called Putinism, then an even deeper question arises: whether war can truly function as a mechanism of social renewal, or whether, in the long run, it inevitably destroys what it tries to preserve. This doubt appears repeatedly throughout history. Civilizations that organized themselves around war often achieved enormous military power, but also faced constant cycles of instability. The logic of the warrior society starts from a simple observation. When a community faces a common danger, its internal divisions decrease. Political differences, social conflicts, regional rivalries, all of this tends to be temporarily suspended. Collective survival becomes the priority. This phenomenon has long been known. During major wars, entire populations often demonstrate extraordinary levels of cooperation. Industries reorganize. Citizens accept sacrifices. Governments expand their authority. The entire country enters a state of mobilization. In this sense, war can indeed create cohesion. It can generate discipline. It can produce a powerful sense of collective purpose. But this same process also has a dangerous side. Because societies permanently organized around war tend to develop extremely rigid structures. The economy becomes dependent on military production. Politics becomes dependent on permanent mobilization. And the entire system begins to require constant conflicts to sustain itself. This dynamic can create a cycle that is difficult to break. If the economy depends on war, if national identity depends on war, if political legitimacy depends on war, then peace can become a problem. Historically, this type of structure has led some regimes to seek successive conflicts. Each victory required new objectives. Each mobilization required new enemies. And each expansion created new unstable frontiers. It was exactly this type of logic that led some empires to expand continuously. Rome during certain periods of its history, Germany during the Nazi regime, other powers that pursued constant territorial growth. But this strategy almost always encountered limits. Resources are exhausted, populations grow tired, and external resistance begins to increase. For this reason, many historians describe prolonged expansionist wars as unstable systems. They may function for some time, but often end up creating internal crises or devastating external confrontations. In the case of contemporary Russia, some analysts raise exactly this concern. If a society organizes itself around permanent mobilization, it may face increasing pressure over time. Economic pressure, demographic pressure, political pressure. Another important element involves the nature of the modern economy. Prolonged wars require enormous amounts of resources: energy, metals, technology, industrial production. Maintaining a militarized economy can generate temporary growth, but it can also divert investments from essential civilian sectors: education, infrastructure, technological innovation. In addition, there is the demographic issue. Prolonged conflicts tend to especially affect younger populations: soldiers, workers, families. Over decades, this impact can profoundly alter a country's social structure. These factors raise a central strategic question. Can a society based on constant military mobilization remain competitive in a highly technological and economically interdependent world? Or does it risk gradually isolating itself? This question becomes even more complex when we consider the current international scenario. The world is slowly moving toward a multipolar system. Multiple centers of power are emerging simultaneously. United States, China, European Union, Russia, other regional powers. In this type of system, direct conflicts between major powers become extremely dangerous, especially due to the existence of nuclear arsenals. For this reason, disputes often occur in direct levels: regional influence, technology, economy, information. This reality can severely limit strategies based on constant military confrontation, because each local conflict carries the risk of escalation, and any escalation between nuclear powers can have unpredictable consequences. But there is still one final element in this equation: leadership succession. As discussed earlier, highly personalist political systems often face difficulties when a dominant leader leaves power. Institutions must assume responsibility. New leaders must emerge. Internal balances must be rebuilt. If these transitions are poorly managed, internal rivalries may arise. Political factions, conflicts among elites, disputes between institutions. In extreme cases, the state itself may fragment. This type of scenario has occurred at various moments throughout history, especially in regimes where much of the stability depended on the personal authority of a leader. For this reason, some analysts argue that the true test of any political system does not occur during its period of greatest power. It occurs during transition, when the central leader disappears, when new forces begin to compete for influence, when the future of the system must be redefined. If institutions are solid, the system can survive. If they are weak, the transition can become turbulent. In the case of Russia, these questions remain open. No one knows exactly how the political system will evolve in the coming decades. But one thing is certain: history repeatedly shows that the fate of a nation is rarely determined only by external wars. It depends above all on how that society organizes its own power. And that is precisely why debates about ideologies, such as so-called I-Putinism, continue to generate so much interest among geopolitical analysts. Because, in the end, these ideas are not only about Russia. They reflect a much broader debate about the role of war, about the nature of modern societies, and about how nations try to find meaning and purpose in an increasingly uncertain world. Perhaps it is precisely at this point that this discussion becomes most relevant to you. It forces us to ask, what kind of society do we want to build? A society based on consumption, or a society permanently mobilized for conflict? And this question, sooner or later, ends up reaching all nations. If we take this theory to its ultimate consequences, we arrive at an unsettling conclusion. A society permanently organized around war needs something essential to function: central authority, strong leadership, a figure capable of directing collective energy. Without this figure, the very logic of permanent mobilization can turn against the system. Historically, highly militarized societies have almost always depended on very powerful leaders: kings, emperors, dominant generals, figures capable of controlling different power groups, especially the military itself. Because when an entire society organizes itself around a warrior logic, military power becomes immense. Armed soldiers, experienced generals, highly disciplined military institutions. This type of structure can be a great external force, but it can also represent an internal risk. If there is no unquestionable central authority, different factions may begin to compete for control. Generals may compete with one another. Political elites may try to capture power. and the system may fragment rapidly. This is a classic problem in societies based on warrior culture. As long as a strong leader exists, unity may appear solid. But when that leader disappears, accumulated tensions can explode. History records numerous examples of this phenomenon. Empires that remained stable for decades under a dominant leader, but entered internal conflict shortly after their death. It is precisely here that what some analysts consider the greatest vulnerability of the contemporary Russian political system emerges: the issue of succession. The current system of power in Russia was shaped over many years under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. His political authority, his control over institutions, and his ability to balance different elites play a central role in the regime's stability. But no leader remains forever. And when a central figure dominates the system for a long time, succession becomes a particularly delicate moment. Who takes control? How to maintain unity among different centers of power? How to avoid disputes between military, political, and economic factions? According to some analyses, this may be the true structural weakness of contemporary Russia. Not necessarily its economy, nor its army, but the future after the current leadership. If an entire society is organized around permanent mobilization for conflict, that mobilization requires direction, coordination, discipline. Without this, powerful military forces may begin to act independently. Generals may dispute authority. Regions may seek autonomy, and the state itself may face centrifugal pressures. In highly centralized systems, this type of transition can be particularly dangerous, because institutions are often not designed to operate without the dominant figure that held them together. This concern is not exclusive to Russia. It appears in many political systems throughout history, whenever much of the stability depends on the authority of a single leader. When that leader disappears, two things can happen. If strong institutions exist, the transition may occur relatively smoothly. But if the system is excessively personalist, internal disputes may emerge rapidly. Some analysts argue that societies organized around permanent military mobilization face exactly this dilemma. They need strong leaders. But very strong leaders can weaken independent institutions. And when those leaders disappear, the system may lack clear mechanisms of succession. This paradox is at the center of many discussions about Russia's future. On one hand, the current leadership managed to restore stability after the chaos of the 1990s, reorganized institutions, strengthened state power, and consolidated a more assertive national identity. On the other hand, the more a system identifies with a single leadership, the more complex its future transition may become. And this moment of transition may define the destiny of a country for generations. This does not necessarily mean that collapse is inevitable. States can adapt their institutions, create mechanisms of succession, and ensure political continuity. But the more centralized a system is, the greater the challenge tends to be. For this reason, some analysts suggest that the true test of so-called Putinism has not yet occurred. It will not occur during the peak of mobilization, nor during external conflicts. It will occur at the moment when the current leadership leaves power. It will be at that moment that it will become clear whether the system has built institutions capable of surviving beyond a single leader, or whether internal tensions will begin to emerge. This question remains unanswered, because history is still unfolding, and Russia's future will depend not only on wars or geopolitical disputes, but also on how its own political system will evolve in the coming years. Perhaps this is the final lesson of this entire discussion. Great powers are not defined only by their military strength. They are defined by their ability to manage power over time, especially in the most delicate moments of transition. And it is precisely in these moments that the fate of a nation can change completely. Each historical discovery reveals new clues, but also raises new questions. Because when it comes to the past, there is always something we still do not understand. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
A deeply provocative idea circulates among historians and scholars of religion. What if the religion we now know as Christianity was not directly founded by Jesus? This hypothesis appears in various academic debates about the origins of Christianity. Some researchers argue that there is a significant difference between what Jesus originally taught and what later became institutional Christian doctrine. According to this interpretation, the central figure in the formation of historical Christianity would have been someone else, the Apostle Paul. To understand this hypothesis, we need to go back to the 1st century of our era. At that time, there was no such thing as Christianity. There was no Bible. There was no structured church, and certainly no consolidated theological system. There was only an emerging religious movement around a Jewish preacher named Jesus. For some scholars, the teachings of Jesus were much closer to spiritual currents now known as Gnosticism. Gnosticism was not a single religion. It was a set of spiritual traditions that emphasized a central element: inner knowledge. The word gnosis means deep knowledge, but this is not ordinary intellectual knowledge. It refers to a direct spiritual perception of reality. Within these traditions, it was believed that the universe had different levels of truth. Many ancient religious systems presented something similar to 3 layers of teaching: a public layer, an inner layer, and a secret layer reserved for initiates. This structure appears in various spiritual traditions throughout history. At the public level, teachings tend to be simple: moral messages, symbolic stories, ethical guidance for everyday life. In the canonical Gospels, we see many examples of this type of teaching. The Sermon on the Mount is one of the most well-known. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. For the general public, this phrase conveys a message of comfort. It suggests that spiritual value does not depend on material wealth. But some interpreters argue that statements like this may carry deeper meanings within ancient spiritual traditions, meanings accessible only to close disciples. It is at this point that ancient texts discovered in the 20th century come into play. In 1945, archaeologists found a collection of manuscripts near the Egyptian city of Nag Hammadi. Among these texts was a document known as the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus did not found Christianity. This text is not part of the traditional New Testament, but it contains a series of sayings attributed to Jesus. Some of these sayings appear to have a deeply mystical character. One of them says the following: "There is a light within the human being, and that light can illuminate the entire world. But if it does not shine, it remains in darkness." Jesus did not found Christianity? Gnostic interpretations understand this phrase as a reference to a divine spark present within each person, an inner connection to a higher spiritual reality. According to certain Gnostic systems, the material universe would be only an imperfect part of reality. The true origin of existence would lie in a supreme divine source. Some traditions called this source the monad, the one, an absolute, perfect, and eternal principle. According to certain Gnostic myths, the material world would have arisen from a cosmic error. An imperfect entity would have created physical reality without fully understanding divine order. This idea appears in different versions within Gnostic literature. In some of them, The creator of the material world is seen as a being ignorant of the true spiritual reality. Jesus did not found Christianity. Within this perspective, the mission of spiritual figures like Jesus would be to reveal a liberating knowledge, a knowledge capable of awakening the divine spark within human beings. This awakening would allow one to transcend the limitations of the material world. It is important to remember that these interpretations are the subject of intense academic debate. Not all historians agree with the idea that Jesus was a Gnostic teacher. Many scholars argue that Gnosticism developed only decades later, possibly influenced by various philosophical and religious traditions of antiquity. Even so, the existence of these texts shows that the first generations of Jesus' followers were not a homogeneous movement. There were many different interpretations of who he was, and of the meaning of his teachings. Some saw him as a prophet, others as a spiritual teacher, still others as a messianic figure. The crucifixion of Jesus played a decisive role in this process. In first-century Palestine, the execution of a religious leader could produce an unexpected effect. Instead of ending a movement, it could transform it into something even greater. When a figure considered prophetic died in a dramatic way, followers often interpreted the event as proof of spiritual significance. Some analysts suggest that something similar occurred after the death of Jesus. The public execution generated shock and also curiosity. People began to ask, who was this man? Why was he considered dangerous by the authorities? In this environment of intense religious expectation, new interpretations began to emerge. Some of them reinterpreted the death of Jesus as part of a divine plan of redemption. It was in this context that the thought of Paul of Tarsus began to gain influence. Paul developed a profoundly different theological interpretation. For him, Jesus was not only a spiritual teacher, he was the Savior sent by God. His death was not only tragic, it was redemptive. According to Paul, the crucifixion was part of a divine plan to save humanity. This interpretation completely transformed the movement, from a spiritual teaching centered on inner transformation, to a religion centered on faith in a divine Savior. If this historical reading is correct, then Christianity would have undergone a profound transformation in the first decades after the death of Jesus. A transformation that would shape one of the largest religions in human history. But the question remains open. What exactly was the original teaching of Jesus? And to what extent was it reinterpreted by his later followers? This question continues to fascinate historians, theologians, and researchers to this day, because understanding the origins of such an influential spiritual tradition also means understanding a fundamental part of the history of civilization itself. To understand how this process happened, we need to look closely at the historical environment of the first century. Palestine at that time lived under the rule of the Roman Empire. The Roman presence generated constant tension. There were heavy taxes, military control, and a permanent climate of messianic expectation among many Jewish groups. Various religious movements emerged promising spiritual renewal or political liberation. Some leaders were seen as prophets. Others were considered possible messiahs. In this context, any preacher who gathered followers could be seen as a threat by the authorities. Jerusalem was the center of this scenario. It was the religious capital of the Jewish people. The great temple was there. Priests, religious leaders, and scholars of the law gathered there. But it was also where Roman power was most visible. For an itinerant preacher like Jesus, going to Jerusalem meant entering the heart of the religious debate of that time. There were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and other groups competing for spiritual influence over the population. Each had different interpretations of Jewish law, and each defended its own religious authority. A new teacher attracting followers could easily generate conflict, not only with Roman authorities, but also with established religious leadership. According to some historical interpretations, Jesus did not have significant political protection. He did not lead an armed movement, nor was he associated with a powerful faction. This made his position extremely vulnerable. For Roman authorities, popular prophets could represent a risk. Religious movements sometimes turned into revolts, and revolts needed to be suppressed quickly. Crucifixion was one of the most common forms of execution for those considered political agitators. But there is a curious paradox in this process. Public executions intended to eliminate a movement sometimes produce the opposite effect. They could transform the victim into a martyr, and martyrs often become powerful symbols. When someone dies defending a message, that death can amplify the impact of the message itself. Followers begin to see the event as proof of authenticity. A teacher who accepts death for what he teaches may appear even more convincing. This phenomenon appears many times in history. Religious, political, and philosophical movements often grow stronger after the death of their leaders. Death becomes narrative, and the narrative strengthens the community of followers. In the case of Jesus, his execution provoked exactly this kind of reaction. His disciples continued to speak about him. Stories began to circulate. Accounts of his teachings were shared among different communities. It was in this environment that various interpretations of Jesus began to develop. Some communities emphasized his moral teachings. Others highlighted spiritual experiences associated with him. And others began to interpret him as a messianic figure with a cosmic role in history. Among these interpretations, the view developed by Paul of Tarsus would become the most influential. Paul had not been a direct disciple of Jesus during his lifetime, but he had profound religious experiences that led him to interpret Jesus in a completely new way. According to Paul, the death of Jesus had a universal meaning. It was not just the death of a spiritual teacher. It was a cosmic event, an act of redemption for all humanity. This interpretation radically transformed the original message of the movement. Instead of a spiritual path centered on self-knowledge and inner transformation, the new theology placed the focus on faith in Christ. Salvation came to depend on belief in his death and resurrection. This theological model was much easier to transmit, and also much more accessible to populations outside the Jewish context. This allowed the movement to expand rapidly throughout the Roman world. Christian communities began to appear in various cities: Greece, Asia Minor, Rome. The movement ceased to be just a current within Judaism. It became an emerging global religion. But this transformation also generated internal tensions. Some groups continued to defend more mystical or philosophical interpretations of Jesus' teachings. Others adopted the more structured theology presented by Paul. Over time, the version that would become dominant was what would later be called Orthodox Christianity. Other currents, such as various forms of Gnosticism, ended up being considered heretical by the authorities of the emerging church. Many of their texts disappeared. Others survived only in fragments. Some were rediscovered centuries later, as happened with the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. These modern discoveries reignited debates about the origins of Christianity. They showed that the first centuries of this religious tradition were far more diverse than previously imagined. There were multiple interpretations, multiple communities, and multiple ways of understanding the figure of Jesus. Perhaps we may never fully reconstruct what happened in that period. Most historical sources were written decades after the events, and many voices disappeared over time. But what we know today is enough to reveal something fascinating. The birth of Christianity was a complex process, a process marked by debates, interpretations, and profound theological transformations. Understanding this process does not diminish the historical importance of Christianity. On the contrary, it shows how spiritual ideas can evolve, adapt, and influence entire civilizations. Because, in the end, religions are not only systems of belief, they are also historical narratives. Narratives that continue to be reinterpreted by each new generation. And perhaps, it is precisely this capacity for transformation that explains why certain ideas cross centuries and continue to shape human history. Throughout history, many events have been recorded, but others have disappeared over time. Lost manuscripts, forgotten accounts, evidence that never reached us. But this raises an inevitable question. How many truths of history do we really know? Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
During the last 100 years, a silent transformation has occurred in the way human societies organize their energies. A transformation so profound that it has shaped not only the economy, but also the way we think, work, and feel. Today, we live in the richest society in the entire history of humanity, and, at the same time, one of the most anxious. To understand this paradox, we need to observe a central idea that emerged over the last century. The idea that money has become, in a certain sense, the new center of human existence. Not just a medium of exchange, but an absolute objective. A kind of abstract divinity that organizes all social life. Money is, at the same time, nothing and everything. Nothing, because it is just a symbol. Everything, because it controls virtually all human decisions. When a society accepts that money represents absolute value, something curious happens. People begin to dedicate their entire lives to its accumulation, even when they already have more than they could ever use. The goal ceases to be the satisfaction of real needs. The goal becomes the pursuit of money itself, an infinite process, with no clear conclusion, with no endpoint. But this was not the only innovation that shaped the modern economy. There's a second fundamental element that helped direct the energy of human societies: the systematic creation of anxiety. Anxiety does not arise only spontaneously within society. It can be produced, organized, structured, and when that happens, people begin to focus their energies much more intensely. They work more, produce more, compete more. One of the most effective tools for generating anxiety is debt. The logic is simple. Imagine that someone lends you a large amount of money, perhaps $1 million. At first, this seems like an opportunity, an advantage, a boost to move forward in life. But along with that money comes an obligation, a debt that must be repaid. And usually, that debt includes interest. With interest, the situation changes, because the debt ceases to be just an amount that must be returned. It becomes a permanent structure of pressure, an obligation that can follow someone for decades, or even a lifetime. In many cases, the debt is never fully eliminated. It simply changes form. It extends. It reorganizes itself. But it remains present. This mechanism creates a very specific type of anxiety, a productive anxiety, an anxiety that keeps people constantly active, always working, always producing, always trying to pay something that seems to be always one step ahead. This dynamic allows far more energy to be extracted from a society than would be possible under normal conditions. But debt is not the only mechanism used to generate this social pressure. There is also a second powerful element: inequality. When a society establishes a clear division between rich and poor, it creates a specific type of psychological incentive. The middle class observes poverty and fears falling into it. This fear works as an invisible engine, a constant drive to work more, produce more, compete more. At the same time, inequality creates an implicit promise. The promise of ascent. The idea that, with enough effort, anyone can rise in the economic hierarchy. Even when, in practice, this mobility is extremely limited. What matters is not only real mobility, but the perception of possibility. Because that perception keeps people engaged in the system. There is still a third mechanism that helps keep this structure functioning: the periodic destruction of wealth. It may seem paradoxical, but in many historical situations, destroying wealth has been a way to restart the economic system. When a society accumulates too much wealth, a curious phenomenon occurs. People begin to work less. They become more complacent, more relaxed, less willing to compete. For those who wish to maintain a highly productive society, this can be seen as a problem. And the solution often emerges in dramatic ways: wars, economic crises, financial collapses, events that destroy accumulated wealth and force the population to rebuild everything again. Imagine a simple scenario. Peasants work for years, produce large quantities of grain, build full granaries. At a certain point, they have enough reserves to live comfortably. They may not even need to work as much as before. Now imagine that those granaries are destroyed, burned, looted, economic collapse. Suddenly, all that security disappears, and the cycle of work begins again, with even greater intensity. Within this logic, wars and crises cease to be merely historical accidents. They begin to function as structural mechanisms within certain economic systems. Events that restart the productive cycle. Events that restore collective anxiety. Events that set the entire society back into motion. This helps explain one of the strangest paradoxes of the modern world. There has never been so much wealth. There has never been so much technology. There has never been so much productive capacity. And yet, modern societies remain deeply anxious, indebted, pressured, in a constant state of urgency. This happens because certain mechanisms have been refined over the centuries. Mechanisms capable of extracting the maximum possible human energy. 3 of them stand out: the illusion of freedom, the absolute centrality of money, and the constant production of anxiety. These 3 elements form the foundation of an extremely powerful system, a system that shapes behavior, defines priorities, and directs the lives of billions of people. But to fully understand how the system works, we need to analyze another phenomenon. A phenomenon that connects economic power, global mobility, and invisible organizational structures. The phenomenon known as transnational capital. To understand the functioning of transnational capital, we need to observe a fundamental change that occurred in the structure of economic power. For much of history, wealth and territory were deeply connected. Large landowners depended directly on the place where they lived. Their wealth was tied to the land, to local production, to the population that worked in that territory. But with the advancement of global capitalism, this relationship began to change. Gradually, capital became mobile, capable of crossing borders, capable of moving rapidly to new economic centers. This mobility created a new type of elite, an elite that does not depend on a single nation, nor on a single society. An elite whose main commitment is not to territory, but to capital itself. The objective becomes simple: protect capital, and make it grow, regardless of where that happens. When social tensions increase in a given country, capital can simply move. Companies relocate their headquarters. Investments migrate. Fortunes are transferred to new jurisdictions. This process is not rare in the contemporary world. In fact, it has become a normal part of how the global economy functions. Today, many extremely wealthy individuals choose to live in places like Dubai, Hong Kong, or Singapore. Not necessarily because they like these places, but because these centers offer favorable conditions for capital, lower taxes, more flexible regulatory environments, greater asset protection, This phenomenon creates a curious reality. Wealth becomes increasingly global, while most people remain deeply tied to the place where they live. The working class rarely has the same mobility. It depends on the local economy, on available jobs, on the surrounding social structures. This difference creates a structural imbalance. One group can move freely across the world. The other remains tied to local circumstances. This system forms what some thinkers call transnational capital, a global network of wealth that operates above national borders. But then an important question arises: how does this capital manage to function on a global scale? Because moving money between countries is not just a technical matter. There is a much deeper issue: trust. When someone arrives in a new country, they usually know no one. They have no local social networks. They do not know whom to trust. And yet, massive flows of capital cross the planet every day. Throughout history, one of the solutions found for this problem was the creation of closed networks. Networks of trust. Organized structures that connect powerful individuals in different regions of the world. In some historical contexts, these networks took the form of discrete societies, groups that share values, codes, and common interests. These structures allow members of the same network to cooperate even in distant places. They function as parallel systems of trust. These organizations do not arise only for mysterious or conspiratorial reasons. They respond to practical needs for coordination, needs for cooperation among economic elites, and needs to maintain common interests over time. Within these networks, different social classes begin to develop very distinct worldviews. The common class, often historically called peasants or workers, has relatively simple aspirations: to build a family, to earn a living, to live a stable life, to participate in religious traditions, to find moral meaning in everyday life. These religious traditions usually emphasize virtues such as kindness, humility, and compassion. They teach that the individual should be a good person, should act with honesty, should seek a morally correct life. This type of worldview works well for stable societies, societies in which social cooperation is essential. But the elites who manage complex economic systems face different dilemmas. To maintain structures of power and control, they often need to make difficult decisions that may cause suffering, economic crises, social conflicts, or even wars. This creates a deep psychological tension. Because human beings have natural moral limits, even powerful individuals struggle to carry out actions that harm others. So a fundamental question arises: how can someone carry out morally difficult actions without coming into conflict with their own conscience? The answer involves a well-known psychological mechanism: the transfer of responsibility. When a person believes they are merely obeying orders, their sense of guilt diminishes. They stop seeing the action as a personal choice and begin to see it as part of a larger system. This phenomenon was demonstrated in a striking way in a famous social psychology experiment. At the end of the 20th century, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a study at Yale University. The experiment was simple. Participants believed they were administering electric shocks to another person. Each mistake made by the victim would result in a stronger shock. In reality, the person receiving the shocks was an actor. But the participants did not know that. Milgram wanted to observe how far someone would go when obeying authority. The results were surprising. Many participants were willing to inflict intense pain on another person, even when they realized it seemed morally wrong. Why? Because the responsibility seemed to come from above, from an authority figure. Thus, participants could tell themselves, "I am not doing this of my own will. I am just following instructions." This psychological principle is extremely powerful. It allows individuals to participate in complex systems without feeling personally responsible for the consequences. Within certain social structures, this can take even more elaborate forms. Rituals, symbols, narratives that attribute decisions to higher forces, divine forces, historical forces, or inevitable forces of the system. When a person believes they are serving a greater force, their perception of responsibility changes. They begin to see themselves as an instrument, not as an author. This logic can appear in many forms throughout history. Religions, ideologies, symbolic structures that justify difficult decisions, structures that allow individuals to act without feeling they carry the full moral weight of their actions. And it is at this point that the discussion about power, economics, and human psychology becomes deeply complex, because social systems are not sustained only by material resources. They also depend on narratives. Narratives that explain why things are the way they are. Narratives that make power structures acceptable. Narratives that help individuals live with difficult decisions. Understanding these narratives is essential to understanding how the modern world works. Because behind economic and political institutions, there is always a psychological dimension, an invisible dimension, but extremely powerful. When we observe the history of human societies, we realize that power structures are rarely sustained by force alone. They depend on something deeper. They depend on belief systems, on narratives capable of justifying difficult decisions and organizing collective behavior. These narratives are not just stories. They function as psychological mechanisms that allow individuals to act within complex systems without feeling personally responsible for all the consequences. Within many power structures, there arises the need to construct a higher explanation. An explanation that places human decisions under the authority of something greater. Something that transcends the individual. It can be God. It can be history. It can be destiny. Or even invisible forces that supposedly govern the world. This type of symbolic structure fulfills an important function. It allows people involved in difficult decisions to believe they are not acting solely out of self-interest, but for a greater cause, for a mission, for a historical purpose. By transferring responsibility to a higher authority, moral tension decreases. The individual no longer feels alone in facing the consequences of their choices. Throughout history, different groups have developed symbols and mythologies that fulfilled exactly this function. Some turned to religion, others turned to political philosophies, others created organizational structures with their own rituals and codes. These systems function as a common language, a way to align behavior within groups of power. When we analyze these phenomena carefully, we realize that they do not arise only from spiritual motives. They also have a practical dimension, an organizational dimension. They serve to create collective identity. They reinforce internal loyalties. They maintain cohesion among individuals who share similar interests. But there's also an even deeper psychological element. An element linked to how human beings deal with power. Making decisions that affect thousands or millions of people is not simple. These decisions often involve losses, conflicts, crises, social sacrifices. For those at the center of these decisions, the psychological burden can be enormous. That is why many power structures develop symbolic mechanisms that help distribute this burden. Rituals, narratives, internal codes. These elements create an environment in which decisions seem to be part of an inevitable process, of a historical destiny, of a greater order that surpasses individual will. Within this context, symbolic figures often appear: gods of time, gods of order, archetypes that represent impersonal forces governing the world. These figures function as metaphors for broader concepts: control, structure, discipline, social order. By invoking these symbols, individuals can reinterpret their own actions. What once seemed like a personal choice begins to be seen as part of a larger process, a gear within a historical machine. This reduces the sense of individual responsibility and strengthens cohesion within the group. At the same time, these narratives help explain why certain decisions seem inevitable. Wars, economic crises, deep social transformations. Instead of being seen merely as human choices, They begin to be interpreted as necessary events within a larger system. This type of thinking has an important consequence. It creates the feeling that individuals are not fully in control of history, that there are more powerful structural forces, forces that guide the course of events. This perception can relieve guilt, but it can also reinforce power structures. Because when people believe they are merely fulfilling a role within an inevitable order, they become more willing to accept difficult decisions. Decisions that, in other circumstances, might be questioned. Decisions that could generate resistance, but that come to be seen as a natural part of how the world works. This phenomenon helps explain why complex systems can sustain themselves for long periods. They do not rely only on coercion. They also rely on shared beliefs. Beliefs that organize behavior. Beliefs that structure the perception of reality. Beliefs that transform power structures into something apparently natural. However, these structures are never completely stable. There is always a limit to social pressure, a limit to inequality, a limit to collective anxiety. When that limit is exceeded, something begins to change. Throughout history, we repeatedly see the same pattern. When exploitation becomes excessive, when inequality becomes too evident, when collective anxiety reaches unbearable levels, societies enter moments of rupture, revolts, political transformations, deep changes in the structure of power. In these moments, the narratives that sustained the system begin to lose strength. People begin to question the functioning of institutions. They begin to question the legitimacy of elites. They begin to question the economic system itself. And when that happens, a new historical phase begins to take shape. Because human history is not static. It moves in cycles. Cycles of construction, cycles of tension, cycles of rupture, and cycles of reconstruction. Perhaps the most important aspect of understanding these cycles is realizing something fundamental. Social systems are created by people, sustained by people, and, eventually, transformed by people. Understanding how these systems work does not mean accepting all their structures. It simply means seeing more clearly the mechanisms that shape the modern world. Mechanisms that operate in the economy, in politics, in collective psychology, and in the way we organize our societies. Because in the end, the great question remains: if we live in the richest society in human history, why are we still one of the most anxious? The past does not disappear. It remains recorded in ancient monuments, in forgotten texts, and in stories that have crossed centuries. Each discovery reveals a new enigma, and each enigma brings us closer to the truth. You are watching History Secrets. Subscribe and continue investigating the hidden secrets of history. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.